In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers. It's I, Douglas Lain, author of Bash Revolution, and Wave of Mutilation, and Last Week's Apocalypse. Those are three of my books. With me today, as always, Benjamin Studebaker. Ben, introduce yourself to everybody.
Yes, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker. I did my PhD in Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge, and I'm the author of two books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, out with Edinburgh University Press this past fall.
Great. So this week, we were going to be discussing the declassification of the JFK files and Elon Musk and his chainsaw in the federal government, but we've put that out for next week because the news cycle just keeps speeding up. Things keep happening. It seems like as soon as you try to get a handle on one part of the political process, something else emerges. We're talking about Zelensky and Trump. Already that may be a few days, stale. Who knows what's happened today? I don't know. Could be the aliens have landed, but I haven't heard about it yet. So we're going to talk about Trump and Zelensky. What do you think, Ben? Should we just start by running a clip of the affair, of the blow up that was on television?
Yeah, and to preface this, the whole presser is a full hour long. The bit that went viral is just a fragment of the whole thing. If you watch the whole thing, there's a ton of buildup.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I'd like to hear because you have seen the whole thing. So when we're done running this clip, and I probably won't run the full 7 minutes, but I'll just run a bit of it. We can discuss what your impressions were of the whole conversation that was recorded by the media. So, but here is the clip. You know what? I want to make sure that I've got the audio on. Let me try that again. Yeah, I do. Okay. All right, here we
go. He broken this ceasefire. He killed our people, and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly what
this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards.
I'm not playing cards.
Right now, you don't.
You're
playing cards.
Mr. President.
You're playing cards.
Serious.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
Oh, all right. That was a good clip, and it just goes on from there, getting more and more heated. I think I was glad to have seen it and that it was exposed. to the public. We got to see the sausages being made. Unfortunately, it had it did throw a spanner into the works in terms of setting up the negotiation. But you were going to tell us what your impressions were after you watched the entire, what was it, about an hour long conversation?
It's good and long. So
go ahead.
This is, typically speaking, you have some kind of negotiation, you have a discussion when two world leaders come and meet, and then there's a press conference where you explain what took place to the media. Mm-hmm. Generally, when you go into the press conference, there is an agreement about what it is that you've done for the purposes of presenting what you've done to the media. And the parties adhere to this, and they don't look to use the press conference to relitigate any of the things that were discussed or to cause embarrassment to the other party. The press conference is a kind of propaganda opportunity to present a united front and to make it look like progress is being made, that things are stable, that everything is under control and in hand. That is not how they chose to use this one. And that's what really sticks out. I think people, especially older people who are used to watching these things on television, are accustomed to a particular style that both sides flagrantly violated in this talk. Now, there's a question about who started it. There's a question about who baited whom, whether Trump and Vance were trying to get Zelensky to do this, in which case Zelensky took the bait, or is this Zelensky driving the bus and making a decision to go off script? Certainly there's a political valence in terms of how you portray that. Those who say that Trump and Vance started it or led him down that path tend to be critical of them for having broken the diplomatic norms, and those who frame Zelensky as having violated the terms tend to take the side of the president and the vice president. In terms of what actually happened, I think the backdrop here is that there's a minerals deal that's being negotiated. The minerals deal is meant to be a prerequisite for continuous U.S. support while attempts are made to negotiate an end to the conflict. The difficult thing is that any kind of negotiation to the end of the conflict has got, roughly three different major questions that have to be settled. One is the status of Crimea. Another is the status of the Donbass, the eastern provinces. And then the third is to what degree there will continue to be NATO or Western weapons in Ukraine. So is Ukraine going to be a DMZ, or is it going to be armed to the teeth? So I think there is broad agreement among the parties that Crimea is going to be part of Russia. But the other two parts of this potential deal are up in the air. And you can imagine a deal in which Russia gets all three. It gets Crimea, the Donbass, and a DMZ. That might be a bit rich for not just Ukraine, but for the United States. That might look to the United States like a high price to pay. So what the Ukrainians want is, of course, if they're going to give up Crimea, they want the Donbass back, and they want to be armed to the teeth going forward. The American position, I think, would be to give on one of those things, but not both. So to give up the Donbass, but arm the Ukrainians going forward, or to make Ukraine a DMZ in exchange for the Donbass being returned to Ukraine. I think those are the broad frameworks that are possible here. Zelensky tried to tie the minerals deal to a security guarantee. So to something that would involve arming Ukraine or credibly committing to defend Ukraine going forward, which would
those are two different things, though, Ben. Those are very different things, right? Arming Ukraine, we've been doing that. That is a kind of defense, but then the commitment to defend Ukraine could also involve, and I think it implies the involvement of something like Article 5 or some sort of commitment to provide troops either from NATO or from the United States, but kind of a NATO-U.S. commitment. And the difference between NATO and the United States is emerging now, but it's kind of new. So that I think that it sounded to me like Zelensky wanted that kind of guarantee that there would actually be troops deployed if the weaponry that Ukraine has isn't sufficient to hold off a further incursion, right?
Yeah, there are levels of intensity to the security guarantee. So, of course, at the very, very extreme end, there would be NATO membership for Ukraine, which is not likely to happen.
Right.
Then you've got, situations where there are various levels of verbal commitments, but those verbal commitments already exist. There was already a commitment when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in the 90s that it would have some level of security guarantee. Right. Not in terms of NATO membership, but that its security was guaranteed going forward. So there have already been verbal commitments of those kinds. So what Ukraine wants is as close as it can get to NATO membership without getting it.
Yeah, de facto NATO membership is what
right.
Like.
Yes, something like de facto NATO membership. Of course, there are further in between positions. There's giving Ukraine a lot of weapons, but not committing troops.
Right. But look, what Trump's position is give us the mineral rights. We'll split the profits 50-50. That's where he arrived eventually. And by having Americans workers on the ground, you'll already have a kind of security guarantee. And if you want more security, Europe can provide it. We're not going to send U.S. troops in, but Europe can provide what it wants. Not NATO, but Europe. And it seems to me that the EU stepped forward and said, okay. Like the way in which this is being spun is as if, they're rebels against Donald Trump. They're standing firm. There's going to be a new leader of the free world, they say. I forget the guy's name, but the foreign secretary at the EU or something that said that we need a new leader of the free world. And yet what they're doing is providing exactly the kind of guarantee for security that Trump suggested would be appropriate if he got the mineral deal. And they're not offering a new mineral deal, right? They're not trying to take that away from the United States. So in a sense, it's yeah, go ahead.
Yes, this is a very good point, Doug. We have reached a stage here where the Europeans are doing what the U.S. president wants them to do while claiming that they are doing it in rebellion against the U.S. president. And this has massaged public opinion in Europe and gotten Europeans to support something that 10 years ago they would have completely rejected, which is the idea that they should spend not just 2% of GDP on defense, but maybe even 3%. So this is now going above the NATO target, because at this point, there are only 6 NATO member states that still spend less than the 2% target. Canada, by the way, is one of them, along with Spain, I think Belgium, handful of other states. But at this point, the overwhelming majority of the states are hitting the 2% or they're slightly above it. So yes, they are going to increase defense spending. They're going to claim that they're doing it to develop autonomy or independence from the United States, but they're not quitting NATO. Nobody's quitting NATO. NATO isn't going anywhere. NATO still exists. And therefore, all of the intelligence sharing that goes on as part of NATO still exists. So none of these military forces that the Europeans are developing can be credibly positioned as anti-American, because they're all still within the NATO framework. Indeed, additional states have joined NATO within the last few years. So NATO has gotten bigger and has even more in terms of resources than it will have had previously. What it will allow is for the United States to commit fewer hard resources to the European theater and to instead kick those over into the Pacific and to do things to buttress the situation around Taiwan, which the military guys, they're very concerned about Taiwan. They think that we're in a period right now where Taiwan could get rushed before there would be an adequate response. And they think that there should be more military resources deployed to the Pacific in and around that area to deter anything that might get going in the Pacific theater. The Europeans are facilitating that while claiming that they're doing it for anti-American reasons. And this is straightforwardly silly. The only way in which it could plausibly be true is if they actually left NATO and took NATO apart. But they're not doing that. What's going on with the EU and NATO is that it's recognized at this point that it's not possible to expand these organizations further with equal terms granted to the new states that come in. So now states that come into NATO or the EU are going to come in at a kind of lower tier of membership, which isn't going to be formal membership. It's going to be something else, some kind of de facto friendly position in which they get some of the benefits, but these benefits will be negotiated kind of a la carte, and they won't all come together all at once. And this is in part because the Europeans, they don't need to expand these blocs. It causes them various problems to try to expand the blocs. In terms of adding states to NATO creates security competition problems with Russia. Adding states to the European Union creates large amounts of immigration that are difficult for the European states to bear and deal with in terms of logistics and infrastructure. So what they instead want to do is exploit business opportunities and geostrategic opportunities in new states without giving those states all of the benefits of NATO membership or EU membership. And an easy and convenient way to do this is to negotiate all of this a la carte in a high pressure situation where these states have no choice but to agree to an inferior kind of relationship.
Yeah, it sounds to me like they're taking on a Trumpian approach, cutting deals, a la carte, thinking outside the box. Okay, but I want to...
Yeah, and that's something that they've also discussed with respect to the EU for a long time. Their thought is that they expanded the EU too quickly to states that were not yet ready for full EU membership, that they should have done a staged rollout with some states not necessarily on equal footing. This is something that France and Germany explicitly discussed some years ago now.
Yeah. I want to address something from the comments and get back into it here, but Joseph Grosso says it'll take 10 plus years until any minerals get moving. No one will remember any deal. Trump, Vance, Zelensky will be long gone. That's wrong. At least it's not at all guaranteed that Trump, Vance will be long gone in 10 years. If Vance gets elected next and then gets a second term, we're talking 12 years of the Trump, Vance administration. And in that period of time, the opposition party will probably take on many of the policies and perspectives of the Trump-Vance administration, just as 12 years of Reaganism produced the Clinton administration. And so I would say that we are looking at something that has a chance to be institutionalized and worked out as a kind of change to the global system. Would you disagree with that, Ben?
I mean, there's a chance that a future Democratic president could decide that those terms are too onerous for Ukraine and alter it, especially if Trump doesn't get that arrangement ratified as a treaty with a Senate vote that would bind his successors to those terms. It has become more common for presidents to negotiate agreements that they don't ratify as treaties, and that does leave those treaties vulnerable to potential deviation or amendment going forward. And certainly the Ukrainians would be open to amending it if a Democratic administration were open to amending it.
Sure, but on what basis?
It's also
on
very often the case.
Profit sharing was probably what would be amended, not U.S. rights altogether. And the whole model of creating security around business deals rather than membership to NATO, thinking strictly militarily, would probably hold. So you can come in and say, oh, you might say, we're not getting enough. We need 70-30. Or you might say, oh, this is too hard on you. It's 20-80, something like that. But those are negotiating points. That's not the main point. Is providing security for Ukraine through production and business rather than through mere military support. At least that's how I'm thinking of it. Tell me if I'm getting this wrong, Ben.
Well, I think that you are right that increasingly, and this is not just a Trump Republican kind of view, it's also the view of the mainstream liberal leaders in European states like France and Germany, that it's not possible or desirable now to further expand these organizations in a kind of total equal terms way. That instead it has become preferable to a la carte or to leverage the power of the blocs to get more favorable terms from prospective new members. And this is something, by the way, that just happens in international politics throughout human history. When a state gets really big and it gets really powerful, it becomes less inclined, and not just a state, but an alliance system, a federation of states, a confederation of states. These blocs, as they get bigger and bigger and stronger, they become less inclined to give prospective new members the same terms that the old members enjoy. We talk about all of this with respect to, say, Puerto Rico, right? Puerto Rico is not given equal terms as the existing 50 U.S. states. It's not granted the rights of a U.S. state, even though if it were added to U.S. territory in the 1850s, given its population, given its economic output, it overwhelmingly would have been likely to have become a state. But because it came along later, after the bloc of states was much stronger and the bloc had much more leverage and much less need for straightforward expansion, you reach a stage where the bloc makes this expansion very, very difficult for the prospective member to get, and uses the fact that the prospective member is in a relation of dependence to grant rights in a partial or fleeting way in exchange for substantial concessions that the bloc, when it was smaller and weaker, would have been in no position to demand. And I think that that is something that is increasingly the paradigm throughout both Europe and the United States. It's not specifically a Trump thing.
When it comes to Puerto Rico, it seems to me the reason that it has not become a state yet is not so much, strictly speaking, like economic or a matter of attempting to dominate Puerto Rico, but rather just that it's not convenient politically for either party to bring Puerto Rico into the U.S. They don't benefit from that.
Right. You don't have to frame it as a kind of very negative normative thing. It's just there's much less reason to do expansion once you're very big. You don't need to do it. Your positive reasons to do it are diminished. And there might be various complications involved from the expansion that are not worth the squeeze. So there's a huge difference between expanding NATO and the European Union to Poland versus Ukraine, because the costs in terms of what Russia does now versus, say, what Russia did in response to the expansion into Poland in the 90s are completely different. So this, and also because the European Union is much bigger, it already has a lot of Eastern European states that it can use as dumping grounds for investment or as sources of cheap labor internal to within the bloc. There isn't a need for Ukraine to play this role. There is a superfluity of these states. There's plenty of them. And there's also plenty of migrants coming to Europe from the Middle East. So there isn't a great big need for a large number of Ukrainian workers. And there are plenty of places still within the European bloc that could use investment. The European bloc hasn't grown very effectively over the last 10, 15 years. There's lots and lots of parts of Europe that need investment. So there isn't a great need for this additional state to come in. And the terms that they're able to offer Ukraine are terms that are less costly to them, while still in their minds giving the Ukrainians things that the Ukrainians say that they want.
Right.
And the Ukrainians can point out that it's not fair that they're not being treated like Poland, and they would have a point. But this is the thing about international politics. It doesn't work on the basis of fairness. Organizations like NATO or the European Union are not, open clubs that anyone has the right to join. It requires the consent of the members, and the members have to think that there's a good reason, over and above whatever costs are involved for admitting a new member on equal terms. And if they don't feel that way, there's no mechanism that can compel them to treat Ukraine as if it were Poland. And a lot of the arguments to do with Ukraine's agency have tried to work on the basis that organizations like NATO or the European Union should be organizations anyone in principle can join if they meet a set of impersonal criteria. If they follow some kind of rule of law system, they should have the right to join. That's not how the EU or NATO work in practice, as much as some people might like those organizations to work in that way. So really, it's Ukraine has been put in a situation where it has extremely little leverage, and therefore it's possible for the terms to be dictated to it.
Okay, so I want to clarify a couple of points. And this question here from the virtual Jonathan, is helpful in doing so. He says, "I love it. Just treat Ukraine like an African nation." LOL. That LOL, by the way, I feel like people need to retire it, put it in mothballs. But the other thing is this: I think what he's pointing to there is that, you know, in Africa, when foreign investors come in and claim rights and extract resources, it hasn't led to development or stability for many African nations, right? Just to put it abstractly. So the question for Ukraine would be, to what extent would being involved in the EU and in kind of a de facto member of NATO also give it enough autonomy to set its own course in terms of development and develop its own national base and become productive and affluent. So I think that there's that question, and then the other question is really about what we're calling security. But you know, who would be obligated to provide troops if the country is invaded? Is the way to put it, you know, bluntly. And those are kind of two different questions, right? But they're kind of being tied together in a sense, because what happens when you have a significant amount of economic investment in a region from a powerful nation, that nation wants to protect its interests and will provide some level of security to do so. And it can do that not only with troops, but also by making economic threats, financial threats to those nations that might seek a violent solution for political problems in the region. Say, if you let people come in here with guns and mess up our operation, you know, these trade deals we have over here are going to be nixed. So there's multiple ways in which you can kind of control the situation and secure it when you are operating on the level of business and politics without guns. So anyway, my question is that is it necessarily the case that this approach to handling Ukraine would simply be exploitative and oppressive and leave Ukraine without much of a future and without a road towards development as a more equal player?
Well, I think the commentator is right to point out that certainly this way of interacting with leaders of allied states or kind of weak peripheral states, it's very common, but usually it's done in private. Usually it's done behind closed doors and not in front of the media in that kind of session. And one of the things they've been doing that's a little weird is holding these press conferences in the Oval Office, so that if anything does happen that they don't like, they can say, wow, doing it in the Oval Office, how disrespectful. Typically speaking, they would be held in a somewhat less completely controlled by the American state environment, maybe out on the lawn, maybe, you know, in some kind of conference hall or something that feels a little bit more like a neutral space that's shared by the parties. But they're not looking to do that. They're looking to use these meetings a little bit. And putting it in the Oval Office gives them a tool they can use if the meeting goes in a particular direction to say, hey, look, they violated the terms of the meeting. But of course, putting it in the Oval is itself stretching a little bit what these kinds of press conferences are supposed to be. They're supposed to be, or they're not supposed to literally be a case in which the parties are on the same page, but they're supposed to be a moment in which that appearance is created, that necessary appearance is created. So I'm sympathetic to the commentator's notion that this is the same way that states in other parts of the world have been treated in the past by the Western Bloc. But also, it's the way Ukraine is treated in private. It's the way many European states themselves are treated in private in terms of language, in terms of the kind of discussion that's had. If you go back and read Obama's memoir where he talks about Libya, the way that he blames David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, for what happened there is extraordinarily undiplomatic and extraordinarily rude and vulgar and so on. But it's done in a memoir rather than in a press conference in front of the TV. So we don't get the same kind of reaction to that. And it's a British leader who we treat as, one of our peers, someone that we can criticize because they're our friend, rather than someone who's totally reliant or dependent upon us, who we're then, kind of bullying or picking on for their dependence.
Yeah,
but in fact, the British are just as dependent as any other state is, which is why in the meeting with Keir Starmer, Donald Trump was able to say to him, "You think you could take on Russia by yourself?" Which was the same kind of comment and a similar kind of breach of how that kind of meeting typically historically would go. But I don't think that changing the language here changes the substance very much.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about treating Ukraine like an African nation, we can't think of it just in terms of politeness in a meeting. I mean,
right,
right? So despite his style here, it should be noted that the other option for Ukraine that was on the table and that was being implemented was that Ukraine would simply be in a perpetual state of war with Russia indefinitely. And that, because there is a concern about containing Russia, which is an aggressive nation, and which has violated many treaties in the past. Not that Ukraine hasn't, not that the West hasn't, but it's violated many treaties, is a nuclear power. So it has a considerable amount of military might, just on that basis alone. So the question was, how are we going to try to contain Russia? The whole push east was about containing Russia. One way to do it was a bear hug, bring them into NATO. That was actually floated. That didn't work out. So now pushing east in an effort to try to contain Russia. Ukraine was said, you know what? One, continual hot point, of hot conflict for 30 years. Yeah, okay, we can do that. Trump comes in and says, I don't want to see that many dead bodies. I don't want to see that level of chaos. I would prefer to operate this like a business deal and not do politics through actual, warfare when we can avoid it. That's his position here. And I think I tend to think that is a better deal for the people of Ukraine than continual 30 year war. But am I being hyperbolic?
Most certain. No, you're very right about that. What's the floor for Ukraine? The floor for Ukraine is not the position of these states in Africa that are extremely poor, have a very low per capita income. The floor is Belarus. Belarus is still appendage to Russia and still is appendage to the Russian economic zone, the Eurasian Union, right? Mm-hmm. Belarus has a very, very low per capita income relative to any of those Eastern European states that have been in NATO and been in the EU for a while. Mm-hmm. Ukraine is trying to get the Polish deal. It's not going to get that, but it can still do a lot better than Belarus. Mm-hmm. And if it can't do better than Belarus, then it might as well rejoin the Russian bloc. The whole reason to do all of this is to try to get better treatment than Belarus. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Being Belarus indefinitely was on the table in 2014. Mm-hmm. That kind of possibility is always there for Ukraine. And if we were to treat the Ukrainians sufficiently badly, that's what they would do. They would decide to couple back up with the Russians and would follow that kind of Belarusian strategy.
Right. So Zelensky's dream is this escalates to the point where NATO actually gets involved and pushes Russia out. Then we get some sort of deal like Poland has, and we get to have much better terms for our future. That's Zelensky's vision. Roughly, is that right?
Yeah. He wants Ukraine to be treated like Poland. And it's not going to happen. It's not possible. Ukraine is many, many, many miles east of Poland. And it's a different situation. They're too proximate to Russia. And unless Russia breaks apart, and there have been fantasies entertained by people in DC about this, that the Russian government would collapse and that Russia would then be partitioned into a bunch of smaller states, which could then be slowly, gradually, over a period of a long time, absorbed into NATO and into the European Union, allowing the alliance bloc to gradually extend across Eurasia until it sits on top of China. That fantasy I think is also equally unrealistic, but is something that was entertained. And it was entertained in part because it was very cheap to entertain it in terms of money for the American government. The amount that the Ukraine conflict cost was a tiny fraction each year of what, say, the Iraq War cost, much less, say, the Vietnam War. It was possible to continue this on a military level for without increasing U.S. defense spending beyond roughly, 3.5% of GDP. This is near the lowest level as a percentage of GDP U.S. defense spending has ever been at in the post-World War II era. They're doing this on a threadbare budget. It's really incredible, from their point of view, that they've been able to do it for as long as they've been able to do it. So the Biden argument was that this is a really cheap way of placing a bet, a renewable bet each year on the possibility of a Russian collapse, which would enable the further expansion of NATO and the further expansion of the EU indefinitely eastward. And it would also generate arms production in the United States. It would stimulate that, which could then be useful in containing China. The opposite view is that is an incredibly high price to pay when it might yet be possible to have social relations with the Russians, some kind of civil social relationship. And the question that kicked off this big mess, the question that is asked by the reporter before the set of answers that leads to this interchange between Zelensky and Vance, it's a question about whether the Russians can be trusted and what happens if they violate the terms of the deal. And Trump says, what if someone drops a bomb on your head right now? So his implication is that, of course, you can never be sure that people will honor the terms of their agreements. Nevertheless, if you don't make agreements, then your only alternative is war. So some kind of agreement of some kind or other is the only alternative to continuing to fight the war. And therefore, there's a need to try to make some kind of agreement. And even if the agreement is ultimately unsuccessful, it's worthwhile to attempt that so as to prevent the deaths of enormous numbers of additional people. And this is a relatively basic point, I think. And the fact that the tone and the style and the fact that it happened in this kind of meeting upsets people so much is, I think, a little ridiculous, because ultimately there does have to be some kind of deal. Unless we are committed to the idea that we should continue to put pressure on the Russian state until it potentially collapses into a civil conflict in which the nuclear weapons of the Russian state fall into the hands of these various statelets of an indeterminate character. It's in part because the Soviet Union broke up too quietly. People have this assumption that there's no possibility of breaking this thing in such a way that there's a real problem, because the Soviet Union went away too gently into the night. But we're still dealing with the consequences of the Soviet collapse. This is still part of the Soviet collapse. It is. And there is still a possibility that the Soviet collapse could go very, very badly and very, very wrongly if we take it for granted.
And I would just point out that the idea that Russia is simply going to collapse under the strain of the war in Ukraine, if we keep providing weapons to who in Ukraine, I'm not sure, but I think itself sort of a fantasy, but that was it sounds like you're agreeing with me that was the plan. The plan of the previous administration was to simply, in this way that was not too costly to the United States, and they said this directly, to continue to fund an ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The war would just continue along. And what we're not supposed to notice is how it has escalated already. How it's gone from arming Ukraine with defensive weapons for use within Ukraine, to giving Ukraine long-range weapons in order to attack Russia itself. And right before Trump took office, Russia had launched an ICBM missile, or some sort of continental ballistic missile, that could have had a nuclear warhead on it, and which is impossible, as far as I understand, to shoot down, or very, very difficult to shoot down. So the point of that move was to send a message not just to Ukraine, but to Europe and the United States as well. It's like, you keep going down this road, I do have the capacity to fight back directly.
Yeah, it's a reminder that they work.
Yeah, right.
A demonstration that they work. In case you think they're broken, they do work.
That's right. Yeah. So it was a very dangerous game that was being played in Ukraine, and Trump is trying to end it. And I think we should keep that in mind. But it does seem to me that he could have handled. I mean, it seemed to me that if he had really gotten an agreement with Zelensky beforehand, he wouldn't have needed this explosion to happen. That it's bad in terms of propaganda and PR, the way this is shaken out in the short term. But what do you think
He
about
needled Zelensky a little bit before it heated up. One of the things he said in the course of his answer is that it's difficult to get a deal because he's so hateful.
that?
He called him hateful.
My
Trump
God.
called Zelensky hateful before the bit that everybody is clipped.
Mm.
And it was after Trump answers the question where he calls Zelensky hateful. Before they go on to the next question, Vance goes, I want to say something about this too. So they pile on a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And
What was it?
That,
Is that just because it's amateur hour over there, and they're just like, they just have verbal diarrhea and they just say whatever comes in their heads, or was that strategic? What do you think?
well, they can't know that Zelensky is going to respond in such a way that allows them to spin it as he's ungrateful. They can't know that he's going to do something in response. But what I have noticed that they have been doing in their press conferences with world leaders is they've been pushing it just a bit. You know, like with Trump asking Starmer, you think you could take on Russia by yourself? It's an inappropriate thing to say in that kind of meeting. It is a violation of the usual diplomatic norms. But it's just gently pushing it and seeing what will the leader say or do in this difficult situation I've created, this kind of awkward situation. And if there's a possibility to potentially cause this leader, who I know is hostile to me, some level of embarrassment and maybe damage them politically, I'm open to using the meeting for that purpose. Usually in this meeting, they're on a team against the press, but Trump is willing to potentially use the press against the leaders, the allied leaders in these meetings. He is certainly open to the possibility of using the press against them. And he has been gently pushing it a little bit. And here, because of the tag teaming, and I think also because of the extremity of what was being discussed, it pushed to a level that was beyond what it typically operated at. But they would not be doing this kind of pushing if they weren't interested in what it could potentially generate. But I don't think that they knew what Zelensky would do, or that they could be sure. There's a little bit of internet trolling energy to them. They kind of want to see what happens if they poke a little bit, in part because they view most of the allied leaders as hostile to them, as friendly with the Democrats, as potentially having intervened directly or indirectly in U.S. politics on behalf of the Democrats, particularly the Labour Party in the UK, which, sent over ground troops, in the sense of sent over activists and Labour Party, workers to the United States to canvass, young student people, an actual concrete intervention on the ground, British Labour Party supporters going and participating in the U.S. election as canvassers, as door knockers. So there is I think, a sense in the administration that these leaders don't like him. And you also see this in the Vance speech in Munich. There is this kind of sense of, you guys are not on our side. And yet also there is a function or use to that that's beneficial for both sides. Because if the Europeans can frame themselves as in rebellion against the Americans, then when they do what the Americans want and raise the defense spending, their populations, even the parts of the population that are anti-American or anti-NATO in some kind of latent way, these parts of the population will not only go along with the increase in military expenditure, but they'll cheer it.
Right. Yeah, it's an anti-American move to fulfill Donald Trump's request. Right? And so we can understand this just by looking at internal politics. The Democrats and Republicans make war on each other in ways that often end up being forms of cooperation.
And it's the Democratic Party's request as well. The Democratic Party also wants to pivot to Asia, also wants more military resources located in the Pacific. There are differences in the strategy for how it's to be done and for how quickly you do it and to what degree you're willing to generate acrimony to make it happen fast. You know, the American position is typically that we're a very big, powerful country and we have a long time to make the pivot and we don't have to do it in haste. We don't have to act like we don't have enough time. But generally, Trump has tried to accelerate the pivot and to try to make it happen a little faster by pushing it. He has this tendency to push it. And, you know, the 10% tariff on China is an attempt to accelerate that decoupling, reduce the intensity and strength of the economic relationship. And conversely, you've also got this acceleration in terms of the Europeans. Yes, you have increased your defense spending from many of them are on something like 1.2, 1.3, 1.5% to 2. You've done that, but actually we're going to need you to go beyond 2. Even though the NATO treaty obligation doesn't say that you have to, we need you to. And so we're going to create a situation in which it appears like there is a lack of security until you step up and fill that gap.
Yeah, and we should emphasize this point that is kind of implicit in what you just said, which is that the moves that Europe are making are not aimed at actually breaking free from U.S. power.
Because if it was, they would have to actually get out of NATO. They're sharing all of their military and intelligence secrets with the United States continuously as NATO member states. They are integrated into NATO high command. Their militaries are entirely visible to the United States. As long as they're NATO member states, they're not breaking free. They're not becoming independent. They're not doing something else. They can, set up some kind of, additional organization that provides for some supplementary security in Ukraine if they would like to, as a way of trying to advance the EU Army proposal. But that's the other thing. The EU Army proposal, for one, it was framed not as an alternative to NATO, but as a supplement. And for two, it came from the most liberal, centrist, establishment, technocratic parts of Europe imaginable. That has always been an objective for people like Macron, for people like the new incoming chancellor of Germany. This has been their focal point for a long time, is to try to get some supplementary European participation, in part because they think that having a European army will help to unite the European Union and keep it together amidst various challenges coming from migration, coming from rising economic inequality and social dislocation.
Right. I want to bring up two other things, but the first thing, just to really drive home the point, right now, all the NATO countries rely on the United States for security to a large extent, even those who have some level of independence, like Germany and France and so forth. Beyond that, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, Australia, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Bahrain, the UAE, Qatar, Canada, Colombia, Panama, Honduras, El Salvador, all rely on the United States for security. China indirectly relies on the United States for security, for securing its trade in the sea. And China is not about to want to take on that responsibility globally, because if the United States went away, and Chris has made this point to me many times, and I've always been like, yeah, okay, the sea, whatever. But no, it's actually an important point. It would require a major investment by China to get its navy into a condition where it could police the seas as the United States does. And that would mean drawing resources out of the domestic economy of China. It would be a major expense. So, there could be unintended consequences of that. So China isn't really raring to go to be the new global hegemon. And
this is also why concerns and hopes of whichever kind about China taking Taiwan are ill-founded, because this would, even if China could and did, take Taiwan in terms of moved military forces onto the island of Taiwan and integrate it politically into China.
Mm-hmm.
The conflict that begins there might result in an enormous amount of disruption to naval sea trade in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea. China does not yet have, and it's very difficult to imagine it ever possibly acquiring, a sufficient set of railroads and physical land-based trade infrastructure to make up for any disruption in the functioning of its ports brought about by a conflict in that region, which is why I don't think China will start any kind of conflict there. Even if it does have the capacity to take Taiwan, and the United States would not be able to defend it or expel them, there is this further question about what would then happen with the sea lanes. Would the sea lanes be treated as neutral, or would the United States intervene to disrupt them?
So we should knock on wood about that, right? I mean, and also we should, hope that the United States isn't unduly aggressive in the future too. It seems like there's, things are, we kind of are on thin ice a bit, but the point is all of this is taking place within the context of U.S. hegemony, and that is not going away, but which has now been found not to be adequate either in its old form. I mean, the need to contain Russia is a real need, and it has seemingly in this moment is seeming to fail. And how it's going to fail is the question, right? The fact that Russia is a major nuclear power, it hasn't gone away since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and how to create a stable world system with nukes in it is still not fully worked out, and so, that's the backdrop for all of this. I think that we should probably try to remember, rather than focus on who was rude to who at a press conference, right?
Yeah. And the reason that the Biden administration was able to entertain this is that it was not committed to winning. Its goal was to get a good pump. Its goal was to build up the capacity of the United States to manufacture arms and weapons at scale, so that in the event that there is some kind of conflict in the Pacific region, the United States could fight that conflict for a long period of time without running out of ammunition. That's really the main function and purpose of the war from the Biden administration's point of view. That's what Biden raised whenever anybody challenged it, including in that last press conference when he was trying to stay at the top of the ticket. And he went on and on about how good it was for our domestic manufacturing. We give the Ukrainians money and they give it right back to us, and it grows our economy. This was an instrumentalization of Ukraine with no real ultimate objective of making Ukraine prosperous, rich, happy. The goal was to get the Ukrainians to fight the Russians for an extended period of time so that the Russians would become embroiled in a mess, and so that we could stimulate particular sectors of our economy that needed stimulating. And one thing I think a lot of people on the left get wrong, they think that the defense industry was leading this. It was the administration that felt that we were not manufacturing enough of the right kinds of things, and that the defense industry needed to be poked and incentivized to start making this kind of stuff. And that conflict provided that impetus. And now many of these defense companies are growing like gangbusters. And not just because they're developing new high-tech stuff that they were able to test in Ukraine, and they did an enormous amount of testing of drones, of autonomous weapons, of all kinds of different new systems in Ukraine.
Yeah,
but in
that whole thing
to
about
that,
the drones in New Jersey might be explained by that ultimately, right? Don't you think? Do you remember the drones over New Jersey story? Anyway, keep going.
Yeah. So they did a ton of testing of new technology. And then also now many of these companies have announced plans to build more conventional weapons plants to get that weapons production capacity up internally within the United States. And that, despite all of the rhetoric about Ukrainian agency, there has never been a real commitment to Ukrainian agency. And that's something that Donald Trump revealed publicly here.
Right.
But it's something that wasn't there when the Democrats were in office either. the Democrats allowed the Ukrainians to destroy the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. According to them, the Ukrainians did that unilaterally, and they didn't respond to it by disciplining the Ukrainians for their having done it. So according to their official narrative, they permitted the Ukrainians to destroy the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and create an energy crisis in Europe. Why did they do that? To weaken the position of the Europeans, to create insecurity in Europe, and to compel the Europeans to spend more on defense. Trump scolded them and threatened to leave NATO. Biden, created a situation where there was an acute energy crisis in Germany. The German economy has been in contraction for many, many quarters because this happened.
Yeah.
And nobody disciplined Ukraine for having destroyed that pipeline, if in fact they did do it unilaterally by themselves without talking to the Americans, as the official American narrative claims. This is, a quite serious situation in which, there's a real machination going on here to force a major change in the emphasis of the entire geostrategic order.
I had a conversation with Spencer Leonard through Facebook Messenger yesterday, and he pointed out to me that there was a Norwegian fuel supplier that halted sales to the U.S. Navy over the Trump-Zelensky dispute. And the first thing I thought was, oh, I see. Blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, no big deal. But being rude to Zelensky in a meeting, well, that's it. We're cutting off your fuel. It seems that just seemed crazy to me.
But because it personalizes it. When the Nord Stream 2 pipeline gets blown up and people go, who blew it up? Why did they blow it up? There's no clear culprit, and everyone's able to mystify who the culprit is insofar as there's any evidence pointing or leading in any given direction. But here it's Donald Trump saying to Zelensky certain things. It's Vance saying to Zelensky certain things in front of a camera. So it becomes very concrete. And then all of a sudden, something that's been going on for a long time that those of us who have followed and watched this are perfectly aware of, all of a sudden appears as a new fact to a lot of people for whom it was previously invisible.
Yeah, this is what I want to, Steve Martin, the comedian Steve Martin, who I admire. I've known about him since I was a kid. He was very funny back in the day. Tweets out that we need to impeach Trump after the Zelensky press conference. I can only assume that that's what sparked the tweet. What is going on in the minds of, I guess, rank and file, maybe relatively elite or definitely elite Democrats right now? I mean,
in their minds, we were genuinely respecting Ukrainian agency. Ukraine wanted to join our bloc, and we were respecting their right to make that choice. And their sovereignty and their autonomy. This is something that goes on in universities among IR scholars who are supposed to be studying this as academics. IR papers are getting written and presented, and people are being made to sit through presentations in which there are these lengthy lectures about how you have to listen to the Ukrainian people and their agency. And this is a quite difficult thing in IR, because IR has, until quite recently, been really emphasizing constructivism. It's been really emphasizing the contingent quality of peoples, of states, of societies. When people make reference to these abstractions, what do they mean? Shouldn't we question whether these things do have a unitary will or a unitary character that we can potentially make easy appeal to? But all of this has been chucked out the window in reference to Ukraine. Now, all of a sudden, there's a coherent Ukrainian national people, which has a single will, which has to be listened to and heard, and there can be no questioning whether there's any kind of internal division within that, or whether, what it is that the Ukrainian representatives are saying actually corresponds with the interests of particular people living in Ukraine or particular factions or groups of people living within Ukraine. All of that has to be erased.
Yeah, even as in Ukraine, the media has been completely put under state control, elections have been canceled, and opposition parties have been banned. So how are you, if people that cannot organize politically, cannot communicate freely, and can't vote, are meant to communicate their will in some way? And I'm going to talk like Vance for a second. The soldiers are being dragged to the front lines right now. I mean, what are these people thinking when they talk about Ukrainian independence and the will of the Ukrainian people?
But the fact that it's progressed to that level, even in the university system,
to
the point where IR scholars are not allowed to question any of that, or don't feel comfortable questioning it, don't feel like they could question it and have successful careers as academics, and people like John Mearsheimer are totally canceled, and you can't possibly engage with anything they have to say about any of it. This produces a very toxic situation in which a lot of people aren't able to think about what's going on really at all. And they're certainly not able to see this as part of a long process that has been going on, dating back at least to the pivot to Asia. This is a long process of having the United States be less militarily committed in Europe and more militarily committed in Asia. It's been going on in the background of our lives for many, many years.
Right. Now we need to think about that in a future episode, because I'm not all, on board with the pivot to Asia particularly, but what I want to think about, and maybe what we'll think about in the Parrot Room and talk to the Patreon people about, is just what opportunities there might be in this moment during a pivot for the will of the people in Ukraine, in the United States, in Russia, to exert itself again. Because and I know that's maybe a little Pollyanna and naive, but that's my stance. That's where we should be focusing our energies right now. And when I say the people, I mean working people. But a left that will just reflexively get on board with Keir Starmer or the head of the EU or or any Democrat talking head or MSNBC will never be able to help facilitate the political future of working class people here in America or anywhere else. So I'm shaking my finger at the left as always. So let's wrap it up here. It's just been about an hour. Any final thoughts, Ben, before we do?
Well, I suppose in close, I'll tell the listeners that I have been socially with friends using the term Zelensky whenever anybody gets, does something and doesn't seem sufficiently gracious or thankful, and you go, you didn't even say thank you. I've been doing this joke with people all the time.
Well, Ben, I don't want to be a Zelensky, and I want to thank you for coming on to the podcast and being a regular on the Escalation magazine show. I'm grateful, and I want to express that directly as much as I can.
This means so much to me. You can now have another $60 billion in military aid.
Oh, thank you. All right, I'm going to end the stream here.
In the case of nuclear or radiological